claims policy. You know, the specific claims process over the last years has been the example of a flawed process, Minister. And it's an example of not being co-developed, and it's also a continued conflict of Canada. And we're releasing a report prepared by the Specific Claims Working Group on your government's inaction of the late specific claims assessment that was done. And we brought in November your attention of the systemic failure over its last 3 years of meeting deadlines to assess those specific claims. I know what you said about specific claims, but I'm talking about the reality which is happening. And its communication was non-effective with Indigenous people. I wanted to be able to add that, you know, your continued ignorance of this failure, and it's watered down. It's not a full independent specific claims process, but most of all, Canada's continued conflict in that process. In our report, it demonstrates how your government is continuing to fail to meet these deadlines. Over 90% of new specific claims have been past the 3-year threshold. So your government's public response have been contradictory. I heard it today again, blaming the lack of resources on the specific claims branch for failing to meet the legislated time frame on one hand, and then the First Nations, you know, there needs to be a plan to deal with that backlog. And I think there's no resources secured. I heard you say some, but the reality is there's still debt incurred to specific claims. And we've been excluded from any discussion on how to address these backlogs. And the government chooses unilateral over partnership while publicly flaunting how assertions of co-development. I heard it again today. So resolving your outstanding lawful obligations cannot be ignored and delayed any further. Your department officials note that unofficial specific claims form 35% of Canada's contingent liability. That was made at the joint gathering in Vancouver last year. And I'm going to touch really quickly now on what you were just talking about with the reconciliation framework. Recognition before continued flawed policy. That's what we're saying, and that's what I heard the hosts here and the treaty nations say, the recognition of their treaties. And there's nothing in writing about what you just said about the repeal of the comprehensive claims and inherent right to self-government by June. And that's why all the people were here yesterday and came in and to make sure that the leadership were talking about that. So the Canada's efforts to overhaul its federal foreign policies to date have been conducted in a rushed, furtive, and divisive manner. And its willful, consistent withholding or parsing out information has resulted in this piecemeal and exclusionary process of engagement with First Nations that's characterized by insufficient timeframes and inadequate representation. The process has not adhered to the free, prior, informed consent of the United Nations declarations. In fact, the two representatives appointed by Canada are Kim Baird and Tom Isaac. Both appointments bring clear biases and resulted are non-starters, and I said that directly to ADM Joe Wild at our meeting last year. And there's issues with both of them in regard to those outside the treaty process, and also even with Tom Isaac, he's consistently opposed the United Nations C-262 bill. And then also I think the other point is unacceptable to negotiate a recognition of rights-based policy for those inside the BCTC process in isolation and secrecy as those outside of the BCTC process, and we will not have their rights directly impacted. And I think that's a huge issue. And you mentioned the Secwepemc Treaty. Well, you know all of our nations are not in the Secwepemc Treaty, and it's still extinguishment. And I don't know, I expressed this to you personally, those outside and those other nations that are outside that treaty is still extinguishment to us. And the process, you say, is no longer cede, surrendered, extinguishment, but it is to us that are outside that treaty process. And that is not free, prior, informed consent, Minister Bennett.
Thank you very much, Judy.